You're listening to the DolphinsTalk.com podcast network. Welcome to Dolphins Talk Weekly, your one-stop audio breakdown of all of this week's Miami Dolphins news. Now, here is your host, Kevin Durr.
Happy Monday, Dolphins, and welcome to another episode of Dolphins Talk Weekly. I am your host, Kevin Dern, flying solo on this edition of the show. You can find me on Twitter at KevinMD4. You can listen to the show on Spotify, iTunes, Spreaker, Podbean, or wherever else you get your podcast. And this episode of Dolphins Talk Weekly is brought to you by Caneswear. Caneswear is the place to go for officially licensed apparel for the Miami Dolphins, Miami Heat, the Hurricanes, Florida Panthers, and all of the professional and college teams in South Florida. Looking for the latest jersey, a birthday gift, or the newest hat to hit the market of your favorite South Florida team? Check out Caneswear for their overwhelming selection of sports apparel. Located at 2655 South University Drive in Davie, Florida, Caneswear has it all. Not in South Florida? No worries. Visit Caneswear.com to shop their inventory from the comfort of your own home, and they'll ship to you, as well as international fans too. Caneswear.com is the spot that Miami fans shop. That's Caneswear.com. Caneswear, WEAR.com. Lots to talk about on this new episode of Dolphins Talk Weekly. It's been a while since Evan and I joined you, and even longer since I had a solo episode. A little pilot joke for Evan, who's done strike training and is now doing carrier qualifications somewhere in the United States. But we'll begin this episode with a long-awaited whiskey segment. I've had this bottle sitting on my shelf, and since it is Father's Day weekend 2024, I've had this bottle sitting on my shelf for exactly 4 years now. My wife got this for me my first ever Father's Day in 2020 after our daughter Emerson was born. Lagavulin 12. Opening it this weekend because I had a pretty big promotion come my way at work, and I'm now leading a global team. So that's pretty cool, and it's Father's Day weekend. There's nothing else really going on with any of my sports teams, so I figured why not? So Lagavulin 12, I've been anticipating this one a long time, have never tried it. I've tried every other Lagavulin I could get my hands on, but not this one, so here we go. As Ron Swanson would say, nectar of the gods. That one is about everything you get out of Lagavulin 16, but a lot spicier going down. A little bit of a burn on the tongue with that one, but very, very good. I'll go 4.75 out of 5. That burn lasted a little bit longer than I anticipated. Maybe I took a little bit too big of a sip there, but neither here nor there as we get started to talk about our beloved Dolphins. So, a lot has happened since the last episode. Jaylen Waddle signed his extension. I feel like that's been kind of covered and talked about by multiple outlets, podcasts, even our own here at DolphinsTalk.com. Essentially, it's a good piece of work by the team to get him locked up before that wide receiver market skyrockets even more. You can look at the Dolphins, in this case, in terms of getting ahead of it a little bit. Look at what T. Higgins is going to get on the open market after signing his franchise tag with the Bengals today. So kudos to the Dolphins for getting that done. Happy to have Jaylen Waddle. I think that was kind of the must-have deal that you were going to do if you were going to forgo paying Christian Wilkins, because Tua is kind of, we all knew that was going to happen. If you follow the right people, you knew the Dolphins are going to get Tua's deal done, and it will get done. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But if you're going to forgo paying Christian Wilkins, you wanted that money to be set aside to pay the 21 draft class. Primarily the big three at the top, Jaylen Waddle, who's now got his extension done, Jaelan Phillips, who is on the fifth-year option, and I think they'll hold off on that one just given the injury recovery that he's going to have to go through this year. And then Javon Holland, is kind of the last piece. I can also share that they've had some discussions with linebacker David Long on an extension, who I think merits one, and we'll talk about that a little bit more into the show. But as far as Tua Tagovailoa goes, well, let's back up. Jaylen Waddle, all the accolades, set the rookie catch record, 3 straight 1,000-yard seasons. He's done everything you've asked him to do. He's an outstanding teammate. He's still produced even with Tyreek Hill on the team playing opposite him. Consummate professional. You can always see him working out. Has the chemistry with Tua dating back to their Bama days. This was a no-brainer, and Miami got it done. So kudos to all parties for making this happen. I don't know that there's an update right now that's going to take place with Javon Holland or David Long in the near future, because Miami are still in talks with Tua Tagovailoa and Athletes First. And then you also have Tyreek Hill sort of intimating that he wants to stay a Miami Dolphin for longer. He's under contract for this year and next, but that cap number spikes in a large way in 2025. So you would want to redo that deal in some capacity. And honestly, despite his age, there's no discernible evidence to me that he's slowing down anytime soon. I think it behooves Miami to have a player like that in the offense to go with Waddle and Tua. Like, if you're going to run this precision-based, rhythm, passing-based offense, why would you not do that? And I think Miami ought to do themselves a favor and try and get ahead of it before you start seeing the deals for like T. Higgins next year, Jamar Chase next year. That's a hell of a situation in Cincinnati. And some of the other receivers that are going to be coming onto the market next year. But I think other than the kind of the weirdness off the field with Tyreek, he's been everything and more that you've wanted on the field. So why not do it? And as far as it relates to Tua Tagovailoa, I feel like that extension is going to get done. And I feel like most people are, oh my goodness, Trevor Lawrence is the draft class after Tua, he's getting paid. I think it's a good thing, and I recommend everyone do this. Check out Chris Kaufman, that's at CK Parrott on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it. Check out his thread on why that actually benefits the Dolphins, and now you're sort of in a race against the Packers to do the deal for Jordan Love, and potentially Dallas doing their deal for Dak Prescott, who is also an Athletes First client. But I think now you have sort of your parameters, your guardrails set. You have Jared Goff at the average annual value of $53 million, Trevor Lawrence and Joe Burrow at $55 million. I don't think there's really any measure you can look at and say Trevor Lawrence has outplayed Tua Tagovailoa. I think Trevor Lawrence has sort of not played as well as you would have thought, but he's also had some bad drops. His statistics could look a lot better had the receiving core done their job in Jacksonville, but still not to the degree that Tua has done his job in Miami. And I think that's just the market rate. And essentially, Chris is saying that this data point of having Trevor Lawrence's contract done sort of gives you the high and low end of the market price for where you're going to have to get Tua done. And I think that probably puts the impetus on things to get faster. And Chris also tweeted out, something that Jeremy Fowler said, and then there's another Bleacher Report article that was sort of quote tweeted with the Jeremy Fowler piece. I forget the name of the author, but essentially it sounds like talks with Tua and his side of it are going to ramp up, and quite frankly, now's the perfect time to do it. You don't have training camp for another month and a week. This is the time to get that type of a deal done. At this point, I don't think anything would stop it short of something catastrophic happening off the field to Tua. This is going to happen. It's going to get done. Just be patient. This will work out for the Dolphins and for Tua Tagovailoa. Is sort of the intel that I've gathered from various places and various people. Moving on to the defensive side of the ball, we've seen really two big additions in the last week. And that's sort of the meat of the episode I wanted to talk about, because I am a defensive guy at heart. I think offensively you're pretty well established. You kind of know, obviously, what Tua is and what he needs to progress to. You know the running back room. You know most of the players in the receiver room and what they are going to bring to the table. The tight end room ought to be improved. The offensive line room, you kind of know what you're at. Maybe there's another addition there, although I don't foresee it, just kind of based on what I've heard. Defensively, I think the last week has sort of assuaged some of the concerns that I had. You're bringing in veteran safety Marcus Maye from New Orleans and veteran defensive lineman Calais Campbell from Atlanta. And I want to kind of talk about those guys and how they fit. And I've done some deeper diving on this Ravens Mike Macdonald defensive system and how it all works and can be pieced together. And where I think the Dolphins have kind of made some smart moves and smart additions, and where they still may have a little bit lacking in terms of personnel as we get closer to the start of the season. But we're going to have another sip of this Lagavulin 112 before we dive into that. So we'll just start and do it chronologically. Marcus Maye was the first addition to happen this week. Veteran safety, originally drafted by the Jets, has played with New Orleans, comes over to Miami. Now, this is kind of an interesting twist. You look at Mike Macdonald, who is now the Seahawks head coach, was the Ravens coordinator, came in there in 2022. One of the first signings that Macdonald and the Ravens made was bringing over Marcus Williams from New Orleans. Marcus Williams was drafted by New Orleans in that phenomenal 2017 class. And Google it if you don't know what I'm talking about. Marcus played really well in Dennis Allen's system. Dennis Allen's system, for those that don't know, uses a lot of pre- and post-snap rotation with the safeties and kind of messing with people. Sometimes guys will be lined up on the line and they'll rotate back right in front of the snap and end up as the deep post player. Sometimes they'll be deep, rotate underneath. Sometimes they'll move out to the slot and play in man. There's a lot of stuff going on. Think back to the Dolphins Monday night game against New Orleans in 2021. Saints missed a ton of players due to COVID that night. Miami won that game 20-3. But if you'll recall, Nick Needham had a pick six in that game. The offense only produced 13 points. And it wasn't a very good showing by Tua, who had one really egregiously bad interception over the middle. The next week, the Titans kind of took that game plan, extrapolated on it, and arguably Tua had his worst game of his career. Same kind of thing happened against Kansas City twice this year. Steve Spagnuolo also does a lot of that shifting with safeties. What I'm getting at here is Marcus Maye's got familiarity with it, and now you're bringing him into a system that's based off that Baltimore defense the same way the Ravens brought in Marcus Williams before. And then if you look at what what Baltimore did last year with their three safeties, Kyle Hamilton and Geno Stone were the primary two. Marcus Williams was kind of the third guy. I'd have to fact check these numbers, but I know Kyle Krebs mentioned it on his podcast as well. But I think Kyle Hamilton and Geno Stone both got like 850 plus snaps, and Marcus Williams was around like the 400, 450 mark. That's sort of where I see Marcus Maye. He's dealt with some injuries. He's had a suspension in recent years. But what I sort of see the secondary looking like is if you're in normal personnel, Ramsey and Fuller are going to be your outside corners. If you want to run three safeties, I think the flexibility of Javon Holland and Jordan Poyer allows you to kind of pick and choose maybe which guy you would want to move into the slot or up to the line of scrimmage as an overhang defender. If you recall, back in 2021, Javon Holland's rookie year, when Brian Flores was still the head coach, Miami used him at the line of scrimmage a lot. And think back to that game against Baltimore on Thursday night where they blitzed Lamar Jackson from the Bengal package, their zero blitz look, like 38 of the 55 snaps or whatever it was. you can kind of play around with your flexibility, especially with Jevon Holland. The area with Marcus Maye, and Maye, you can do that as well. His experience with the Jets had quite a few snaps up around the line of scrimmage and different things like that, where you can see him either playing as an overhang defender in the slot, you can see him rotate deep into a split field safety look, you can see him playing sort of center field in their cover 3 stuff, same stuff he did in New Orleans. So it's transferable to what the Dolphins are going to be running under Anthony Weaver. Kind of the one question I have is if you do choose to make Jevon Holland that guy who comes up to the line of scrimmage, or, you match him up against, say, I don't know, a Travis Kelce, for instance, like a bigger tight end who can run, do you have enough foot speed on the back end between Poyer and Maye if you're going to be running 3 safety looks? That's something I would question a little bit. And I think it gives you another option, because I think Kader Kohou can kind of rebound from the poor year he had last year. He's going to have more help in the slot than what he had under Vic Fangio. And then I don't think you're going to see too many situations, or at least you should not see many situations where you put Kader Kohou on the outside as a field or a boundary corner, especially if Cam Smith starts to develop to the point where they're comfortable playing him in that role, and then you move Jalen Ramsey around. And I also think it's highly possible you could see Jalen Ramsey kind of get in these roles where he can rotate back to safety. I think a lot of people forget he did play some safety in college at Florida State. So it's not out of the realm of possibility to see him do that. And I think it gives Miami more flexibility to kind of mix and match defensive personnel on the back end. Like, you want to play with a heavier look. Say you're playing a run-heavy team. You've got Tennessee early in the season. That's probably going to be the case with them. You can mix in more 3 safety stuff. If you're going to play a team like Buffalo, who's going to try and sling it all over the yard, maybe you kind of play with more corners and move Jalen Ramsey into safety or the slot, or overhang looks and do stuff he did when he was with the LA Rams. So I think Brian Duker is in a unique position coming over from Detroit, where they did a lot of that stuff, especially last year when they drafted Brian Branch out of Alabama, where you can kind of play around with how you want to match up against the opponent's receiver structure. So I think, truth be told, this is going to be a defense that's more secondary-centric. Just kind of looking at what Baltimore did last year, you look at their defensive metrics. They were the best pass defense in the league by far in terms of YPA. I think they were near the top in both sacks and turnovers generated. So this is an opportunistic scheme where you're going to be playing a lot of kind of 2 high shells and rotating to cover 3 looks or combo zone looks, sort of the way we rotated with Vic Fangio last year. But it's not going to be as static pre-snap for defenses as it was under Fangio. There's going to be a lot more moving parts, a lot more dynamic pieces moving pre-snap than we saw a year ago. Now, how does that tie into the front with Calais Campbell being an addition? So this defense at its heart, if you're going to play against a traditional personnel set, meaning like 12 personnel, 2 tight ends, or 21 personnel, a fullback, a tight end, and a running back, it's a 3-4 system. Obviously, we know where Zach Sealer fits. He can play pretty much anywhere from a 2-eye out to a 5 technique. Now, I was sort of tipped off that there are certain fronts in this defense where maybe they were using Zach Sealer out wider, like as a 6 technique and sort of some under and over fronts with a heavy end. Now, some of that's probably a byproduct of not having Chubb or Phillips available at this point in time, because they did not participate in OTAs or minicamp. But it's interesting that they chose to use Zach Sealer in that role, because he's always kind of been more effective tighter to the ball than outside. I think Christian Wilkins was more effective in that scenario if you wanted to move a D-tackle out wider. We don't have Christian Wilkins anymore, and none of the other interior players, whether it's Teair Tart, Benito Jones, Neville Gallimore, Jonathan Harris, none of them really strike me as being effective to do that. And if you even look at playing traditional 3-4 sets, really the only other guy who's got true experience lining up as like a 4-eye or 5 technique is Jonathan Harris, who has started a grand total of 4 games in the league. That's where Calais Campbell comes in. You look at how Atlanta used him last year. There's a ton of 3 technique, 4 technique, 4-eye, even some 5 looks. They were not even afraid to stand him up and put him outside as like a 9 technique, which is something you'll see in this defense. Like the front structure is going to look pretty similar in most down and distance circumstances to what we ran under Vic Fangio and even under Josh Poyer once Miami acquired Bradley Chubb. So you have another piece that can kind of move around. You've got Sealer as sort of a flexible piece, kind of 4 technique inward, whereas Calais Campbell can be kind of your flexible piece, 4 technique outward from the ball. But Calais Campbell, as big and as long and as strong as he is, like 6'8", 282, super long arms, can still be effective playing as a 2-eye, a 2, a 3 technique inside, which is what he did when he was with Baltimore. So I think what this gives you is it gives you one other guy to add to the rotation inside. Now you've got sort of 3 guys who are big, long, kind of 3, 4-eye, 4 technique guys with Sealer, Campbell, and to a lesser degree Jonathan Harris. And then you also have kind of 3, maybe 4 guys inside who can play 3 technique tighter into the ball as a true nose. And those guys would be Tier Tart, Benito Jones, Neville Gallimore, who we'll touch on him in a second, and then possibly Brandon Pilley. Neville Gallimore is unique because I think he's probably the one guy you could say could run the gamut from playing as a 0 technique, which he did in Dallas some last year. It wasn't super effective, but he did it. And I think you could be comfortable with Neville Gallimore playing all the way out to like a 5 technique in certain circumstances if you had to. So I think he's got that sort of extra positional flexibility. But I really like having, a veteran presence, someone who can be a leader with Sealer the way Wilkins was, and kind of get those guys motivated. And if you look at what Baltimore did last year, the front structures are pretty similar to what Vic Fangio does, except Baltimore kind of had, I won't say better, but used more throttle control in terms of how they blitzed people. Fangio didn't really like to blitz a whole lot. Baltimore had certain games where they would increase the blitz rate and then certain games where they'd throttle way back. Like, look at what they did against the Bengals early in the season. I think they blitzed something like 3% of the time. And then a couple weeks later, they played the Browns and were up over like 60% of the time because I believe it was a backup quarterback in that day or something like that. And I'm hoping here that Anthony Weaver is bringing pages straight out of Mike Macdonald's playbook, because some of the stuff Mike Macdonald did is pretty cool, and it's stuff that I thought we would see more of under Vic Fangio, but didn't. Maybe not necessarily because Fangio didn't have to. But now you're going into the season where I think Jaylen Phillips is kind of a little bit of a question mark for week 1. But even if he's back, is he really all the way back to the form he was at a year ago? And that's probably going to take some time in ramping up in terms of snap counts and reps. And Bradley Chubb, from what I've heard, probably not going to be ready for week 1. So you don't have those true edge rushers, and you don't really have, well, I guess in some ways you have an Andrew Van Ginkel to sprinkle in the form of Shaquille Barrett, but if he's one of your starters at the start of the season, you're going to have to make some adjustments. And one of the things that Mike Macdonald was really good at in Baltimore was showing simulated pressures and they were pretty aggressive with how they stemmed fronts. One of the keys to this was having Jadeveon Clowney in the lineup, because he could play with his hand in the dirt or stand up. They also had Kyle Van Noy, who had plenty of exposure to this, having been with the Patriots, having been with Miami under Flores, being moved all over the place. And there's a kind of a great piece. Brett Coleman was coming out with a video, but the gist of it, if you follow Bootleg Football or follow Brett on Twitter, check that piece out. But essentially, the Ravens will sort of take their blitz package guys, and there's like 7 different stations where you could possibly blitz from in terms of alignments in their front package, and they basically take all the personnel, whether it's a down lineman, whether it's an edge linebacker, whether it's an off-ball guy, some of the safeties, they all take turns sort of repping through it, so you can bring the same blitz with different personnel out of different looks week after week and kind of keep adjusting. So I think that's something that you can kind of bring to the drawing board in Miami, where you didn't necessarily have that last year. Fangio was more of a, we'll pull out our best pitch when we have to, and it worked in a lot of key circumstances. You think about the end of the Chargers game in week 1. You think about some of the blitzes by David Long the very next week against New England that kind of helped with that game. But that kind of died off as the season went on and injuries mounted. I think with what Baltimore does, there's a great example of this. They played the Raiders, I think 2 years ago, McDonald's first year there, where the Raiders are in a 3-by-1 set. So trips to one side, they got one guy backside. Baltimore's in a dime set. The Raiders have the ball on the hash closest to the single side, so the 3 receivers are on the wide part of the field, and they've got a nickel corner to each side. They bring the backside nickel corner because the quarterback is right-handed, that's his blind side. But the interesting thing that they do, they have 2 deep safeties, and then an outside corner, slot corner, and then the backers walked over because of the 3 receivers. They actually take the slot corner and start drifting him back right before the snap. There's some sort of tell in the Raiders' cadence that gave that away to Baltimore, where that safety started, or the slot guy started dropping, and the safety starts to creep up and blitzes off the edge from about 8 yards. So it's a double edge blitz, but they use a really creative look to get there. We didn't really have that kind of stuff in Miami a year ago. So that's sort of kind of how you can tie a lot of this stuff together. And then you look at, there's some great videos on YouTube of how, just to give you a quick history lesson here, this defense is sort of the combination of a couple different systems. So the origin state of it, ironically enough, is actually at the University of Cincinnati in the 90s when they had a head coach named Rick Minter. Remember the Minter name for a second. His defensive coordinator at the University of Cincinnati was Wink Martindale, who was with the Ravens a couple years ago. So Rick Minter has a son named Jesse Minter. You should know that name. He was the defensive coordinator at Michigan under Jim Harbaugh and is now the defensive coordinator for Harbaugh at the Los Angeles Chargers. Mike McDonald was also, he was with the Ravens, then went to Michigan to work for Harbaugh there, and then came back to the Ravens and worked for John Harbaugh. Some of that Ravens stuff from like the early 2000s when they had Marvin Lewis in the 2000 Ravens defense, and then Rex Ryan when Marvin Lewis got the Bengals job, some of that stuff still existed in the playbook up until like Wink Martindale took over and kind of Mike McDonald brought it back. And if you follow Coach Vass on Twitter, which is at Coach Vass, Chris Vasseur is a defensive consultant for NFL teams and numerous big-time college programs. I know he's done work at Alabama and Georgia, just to name a few. Essentially, he broke it down and said that Mike McDonald is sort of the one who kind of organized the Rick and Jesse Minter defense, some of the stuff that the Ravens kept from Wink Martindale, some of the stuff they kept from Marvin and Rex Ryan, and sort of bucketed all these together, categorized that, gave it better terminology, because I actually have a copy of one of Rex Ryan's old Jets playbooks, and like one of their third down blitzes is like, you know, dime right, flavor ice, shit break popsicle, and it's a bunch of different names, and they all mean something different. Mike McDonald has gone through, and I'm not kidding about the shit break one. That's a real one. Mike McDonald went through and kind of collated it, and now you've got one name for that package that had like 8 words of terminology. So it's more easily digestible for players, easier for coaches to teach conceptually. Hopefully, Anthony Weaver's been able to carry that stuff over and bring that to Miami from that style of defense, because I think, especially early in the season, you're going to have to manufacture pressure if you don't have Jalen Phillips at 100% of what Jalen Phillips can be, and you're missing Bradley Chubb outright. No disrespect to Shaq Barrett, but, you know, how good are we expecting him to be? I think he'll be serviceable. I think he'll be as good or slightly better than Van Ginkel was as a pass rusher. But is that enough? And I think kind of the cool part is if you go and watch some of these Mike McDonald blitzes, if you've ever played basketball, you've probably heard the term screen the screener. Well, there are certain pick stunts that they run in these blitzes where they will set a pick on an interior lineman, have a linebacker come from the second level and pick for a defensive end to rotate back through that same gap. The linebacker then bounces out wide, because ideally you're flushing a right-handed quarterback to his left to make him throw across his body, and now all of a sudden he's got a linebacker in his face who's more athletic than, say, a D tackle or, you know, a defensive end that's the size of Zach Sealer or Calais Campbell. So it's pretty diabolical in terms of the stuff they use, and I was trying to think of a good analogy to kind of give you a way to watch it. But if you go back and you watch the Ravens from last year, against the run, you can kind of pick out the defensive lineman roles and the edge players, but think of David Long for the Dolphins as sort of the Roquan Smith player when you're in run defense, and think of Jordan Brooks as the Patrick Queen player in terms of run defense. But those roles reverse when you're in pass defense. I think Jordan Brooks is going to get a lot of the tougher assignments in terms of linebacker coverage, in terms of some of their spot drops and the depth that they have to go to, the way Roquan Smith did. And I think David Long is going to be more like the Patrick Queen player who can cover backs, he can cover hook to curl, he can go curl to flat, he can be an effective blitzer. I think Long was, for most of the season, if not the entire season, was the number 1 off-ball linebacker in terms of pressure rate. And he was like 4th in terms of like blitz rate or something like that, if you look at Pro Football Focus's stats. So I think, and I also think David Long kind of got a bad rap because Fangio had such a hard-on for Van Ginkel being an off-ball guy, which was a mistake, and I'll never forgive Fangio for that. But if you go back and watch David Long's film in Tennessee, he's a pretty good coverage player if you give him the right role in terms of defense. And I think that's something that Miami will probably have a better handle on this year that they didn't have a handle on last year under Vic. So all this to say, like, I think you can see a lot of moving around with guys in the front 7. Like if you watch Chop Robinson at Penn State, he was very good at rushing over the center or over guards. There's certainly room to do that in this front where you could have him playing in the middle. And he may be getting bigger snaps than maybe all of us expect at the start of the year, just kind of based on the status of Chubb and Phillips. I've seen a couple people talk about, well, he's going to be in the running for defensive of the year and defensive rookie of the year and all that. I'd say pump the brakes on that, but I think he'll be more impactful. I don't know that his impact will necessarily lead to a large influx of volume stats. Like, I have a hard time picturing him getting like 12 or 13 sacks as a rookie the way Alden Smith did for the 49ers back in, what was that, 2011? Anyway, I still think you're going to get pretty good impact out of Chop Robinson because he's sort of fungible in each one of those front styles. And kind of the cool part, if you watch some of those videos about McDonald's breakdown or blitz breakdowns, is he pretty much always tries to give you 5 guys at the line of scrimmage to kind of occupy each of the 5 linemen. usually one or two of those guys is going to drop off and there's going to be pressure from another spot, or at least the appearance of pressure is going to come from another spot. That's sort of the differentiation in that third down package. That's sort of Rex Ryan's brainchild. Rex Ryan loved the overload stuff and was very aggressive. McDonald likes to show the overload stuff, but he isn't always going to bring pressure. He's going to disguise it sometimes, and maybe in situations where you think he's going to bring pressure, they drop. And in other situations, you get plays like that play I mentioned against the Raiders where your strong side safety ends up, your field side safety ends up blitzing from the edge against a 3-by-1 set, which is kind of diabolical, especially when you bring backside edge pressure with it from a nickel. A lot of creative stuff. I think where I would still be concerned is, have you adequately gotten enough players in there that can be part of the rotation to keep up the run defense? Sealer and Wilkins were pretty dominant, and I think the Dolphins fans don't fully appreciate how good Christian Wilkins was at eating double teams. Like, I remember a pretty prominent Dolphins YouTuber saying, well, he disappeared in the Philadelphia game on one of the panels I was on. And that's contemptibly stupid. Like, if you watch him against the Eagles, there's a reason they're double teaming him. There's a reason they're chipping him. There's a reason they keep a back to his side on every pass situation. Like, I don't think fans will fully appreciate what Christian Wilkins did until that run defense starts to kind of slip a little this year, which I think probably has a good chance of happening early on, because even Mike McDonald, when he first came to Baltimore in 2022 as the coordinator, because he had been there previously, it took them 7 or 8 games for that defense to really start clicking. And I think this is a great point that was brought up by Travis Wingfield to me. You look at the first 5 opponents Miami has. All 5 of those teams have brand new defensive coordinators. Now, I would say, Buffalo, does that really count because it's Sean McDermott's defense and he's still there and they're just promoting from within? I can buy that if that's your argument. But let's just say 4 of the first 5 teams have brand new defensive systems, brand new coordinators installed. Miami, in the last 2 years under Mike McDaniel, has come out of the gates pretty effective offensively. You've got a 70-point game in week 3 last year, a 42-point game in week 2 the year before. Scored 36 points against the Chargers in week 1, 20 points against the Belichick defense in week 1. Like, it's been pretty effective out of the gate. And I think that's probably going to be beneficial for Miami this year, because you're going to have to be better offensively out of the gate, because I think it's going to your defense is going to take a little while for everything to click and for the coaches to sort of configure the roles for all the guys that they want to use at the start of the season, especially if you're not getting normal snap count doses from guys like Jaylen Phillips and Bradley Chubb. And if you're going to pare down Zach Sealer's snap counts to build a heavier rotation-based system, because Sealer played like 76% of the snaps last year. Wilkins was over 80. If you're going to pare Sealer down from 76 to, say, like 55, which I think was about the max that any of the Baltimore interior players got, I think like Justin Matabuke was like 55, 57, somewhere around there. If you're going to pare him down that much, do you have enough effectiveness with your other players in that rotation? Like, are you going to get mileage out of Benito Jones, Tier Tart, Neville Gallimore, Jonathan Harris? And I think that's why they opted to bring in Calais Campbell, because at least it gives you another proven veteran who's got that length, the strength, the ability to play the run, the ability to affect the passer. Campbell, despite being 37 years old, had 6.5 sacks last year. He gives you some of that position flexibility if you want to go into some of those 4-man over and under fronts, as he can play sort of the heavy D end, and you can leave Zach Sealer as a 3 technique in those looks. That'd be maximizing the effectiveness of your players, in my opinion. So, needless to say, I think there's a lot on the table for the Dolphins defense, especially after the additions of Maye and Campbell. And I think a lot is kind of riding on Anthony Weaver and Joe Barry to kind of figure out how do you coordinate this run defense to kind of make up for not having 94 in the middle with Zach Sealer. And then if you're going to limit Sealer's snaps, how do you make the rest of that unit more effective? You know, Raekwon Davis was pretty effective in really small doses last year. Same could be said for Deshaun Hand in what I would term micro doses. How do you get good rotational doses out of the rest of that? You know, that's Austin Clark's one of the best defensive line coaches in the game. But how do you mix and match those rotations? How do you coordinate the run defense to get guys to be able to play off the front as well as David Long did a year ago? You know, Jordan Brooks kind of coming from a different system, so it's going to take some time for him to catch on. You don't really have a safety anymore who can fly up and make tackles against the run, who's kind of a big hitter the way you had in Deshaun Elliott a year ago. That's sort of my remaining question for the defense. For the team as a whole, just to kind of put a bow on this episode, if you can get the Tua deal done and then get at least one of the two between David Long and Javon Holland done before the start of the regular season, I think you've done a pretty good bit of business this offseason. And you could feel pretty comfortable going into the season that the drop-off from last year defensively is you're at least going to be able to stem it and kind of back build from the lowest point. It's not going to be a drop off the cliff. So, encouraging couple weeks here for the Dolphins. I'll be even more encouraged once they get Tua's deal done. Thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you for listening to the show. You can follow me on Twitter at KevinMD4. You can follow all the shows and writers here at DolphinsTalk.com. You can listen to Dolphins Talk Weekly on Spotify, iTunes, Spreaker, Podbean, wherever else you get your podcasts. And again, reminder that this episode was brought to you by Caneswear. Caneswear is the place to go for officially licensed apparel for the Miami Dolphins, Miami Heat, the Hurricanes, Florida Panthers, and all of the professional and college teams in South Florida. Looking for the latest jersey, a birthday gift, or the newest hat to hit the market of your favorite South Florida team? Check out Caneswear for their overwhelming selection of sports apparel. Located at 2655 South University Drive in Davie, Florida, Caneswear has it all. Not in South Florida? No worries. Visit caneswear.com to shop their inventory from the comfort of your home, and they'll ship to you. International fans too. Caneswear.com is the spot that Miami fans shop. That's caneswear.com, caneswear.com. Again, KevinMD4 on Twitter. Thank you guys for listening. Have a great week, and fins up.